different systems of thought might have different purposes. You have to be a philosopher of thought to think about that even. And I don't think that became obvious at all until after Nietzsche. Not all belief systems serve the same masters, so to speak. And so you can't assume that every system of thought is doing the same thing. And then you can't assume also that there's only one way to formulate your basic assumptions about the nature of reality. I mean, Heidegger, I didn't discover the relationship between the system of thought that I derived, say, from Nietzsche and Jung and some other people that I read, and Heidegger until much after I had written Maps of Meaning. But Heidegger's study of being is predicated on the idea that being is the fundamental reality, and that is not objective reality, it's not material reality, it's lived experience, it's something like that. Lived experience is real. Okay, that's a presupposition. So you start with that presupposition, then you ask yourself, well, what are the basic elements of lived reality? And then what happens there, or at least what seems to have happened, is that Heidegger identified the same basic elements of lived reality that I identified in Maps of Meaning. And one was the social world, the world that's constructed by humans, which I think is basically an elaborated dominance hierarchy. And it's permanent. So this is where the issue about what constitutes reality becomes very critical. Dominance hierarchies are 300 million years old. They're older than trees. So if you think that's what one definition of what's real is what's persistent across time, then it's almost impossible to find anything more real about life than a dominance hierarchy. So
this goes to your point about lobsters, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's the same bloody circuitry, serotonergic circuitry. I mean, there's another circuit that lobsters use that we don't have that's based on octamine. I think that's the right word. But a lot of the way that lobsters maneuver within dominance hierarchies is the way we maneuver within dominance hierarchies. And if you're an evolutionary thinker, you can't just push that away. And dominance hierarchies are, although you can think about them as a social construct, they're also a natural phenomena, right? So the dominance hierarchy is actually a major part of the environment to which we have adapted. Okay, so there's the dominance hierarchy, that's, we'll say, the social world for the sake of argument. There's the natural world, and there's the experiencing subject. Well, those are Heidegger's categories of being as well. And in some sense, what religious thinking seems to do is to continually posit those three things as interacting causally at the base of being. So, and that's not material reality. There's a lot of things about being that we can't attribute simply to material reality. We may eventually be able to do that, but by that time our notion of what constitutes material will be much different. Okay, so we can't deal with subjectivity within the confines of our materialist theories. And that's partly because those theories are predicated on the elimination of subjectivity as an a priori move, right? The whole point of objective science is to remove subjectivity. Okay, so then it gets removed and, well, you're surprised about it. It's like, well, no, you can't be surprised about it. You removed it right at the beginning. Now, that works for certain purposes. It works very well. But it has consequences, and some of those consequences, as far as I'm concerned, are serious enough to produce two forms of social and mental illness. And one of those would be the succumbing to the temptations of authoritarianism, and the other would be succumbing to the temptations of nihilism, because they're logical consequences of the definition of subjective as non-real. So now then you ask yourself, well, how do you determine whether or not a theory is true? Then you ask yourself, well, what do you mean by true? Well, then you're in trouble. Okay, because I think you can take a Newtonian perspective on that, or a Darwinian perspective, but you can't do both at the same time.
Can you elaborate?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Nietzsche said truth serves life. Okay, in some sense that's a Darwinian idea, okay? If it's true enough so that if you act it out or hold it, that increases your chances of survival and reproduction over long spans of time. That's true. Okay. We have no idea if our detailed knowledge about the material world is going to be the type of knowledge that allows us to survive and reproduce over a long period of time. It's not being tested from a Darwinian perspective at all. And you might say, well, of course the materialist perspective is right. Look what we've built with it. We've built hydrogen bombs, for example. But then you might object to that by saying, well, yeah, we've built hydrogen bombs, but the only reason we could build them or were willing to was because we left things out of the equation. Well, what things? Well, things like, is it really a good idea to build hydrogen bombs, for example? I can give you another example of that. I read a book a while back that was written by a KGB officer who claimed to be exposing the inner workings of the Soviet scientific community with regards to biological warfare. And the people in the institute that he described were trying to cross Ebola with smallpox, because smallpox is extremely infectious and Ebola is extremely deadly. So, like, that's a valid scientific enterprise. Okay, then you think, oh, isn't that interesting that that's a valid scientific enterprise? Because obviously that's insane. So then you think, well, if it's so obvious that that's insane and it's a valid scientific enterprise, well, there's some disconnect there between two different views of what constitute at least appropriate behavior. Now, you know, this is why the definitions of truth start to become so important. It's like, is it truth as expressed in action? Is it truth as it serves Darwinian purposes? Is it truth as defined by the axioms of the materialist philosophy? Which, by the way, aren't even true anymore, because if you go down far enough into material reality, now we know you hit a realm that's so bizarre that we can't even comprehend it. And there's implications of that bizarreness that we can't comprehend. So I would say we will develop a materialist philosophy of consciousness eventually, but it won't be using the same material that we use now, right? So
if I just interject,
yeah.
If I understand correctly, you're talking about in, let's say, the industrialized North, in a society that relies on scientific analysis to establish the fundamental bases on which the rest of the society is predicated.
Yeah.
There are certain assumptions about what is real versus what is not real. What is actually out there. If there's a distinction between subject.
Right. Well, but even there's an implicit assumption that's what's out there